In a clean room in Leipzig, less than half a gram of Vindija Cave bone becomes a 3 billion letter genome. Then some of those letters show up broken into tiny pieces inside people living today, not a whole Neanderthal, not an inner caveman pulling levers in your brain, just fragments, short DNA fragments, passed through families, shuffled by time, and still visible if you know where to look. So how can you be only about 1 to 2% Neanderthal, while living populations preserve a much larger archive of Neanderthal DNA? This is Stickman history. And today we're following one fossil fragment, one 2% DNA strip, and one ancient DNA trail back to when modern humans met one of their closest extinct relatives. Before the lab, before the genome, before the ancestry report, there were people moving through Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Neanderthals lived there from roughly 400,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago. That is not a quick cameo. They hunted, made tools, used fire, buried their dead in some places, though the details are debated. And they were not monsters waiting outside human history. They were another kind of human, adapted to cold landscapes, seasonal movement, and survival. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they disappear as a distinct population. But disappear does not always mean vanish without a trace. The first big clue sits back on that clean room tray, because a bone can be more than a bone if enough DNA survives inside it. Okay, so what did the scientists actually compare? On May 7, 2010, the draft Neanderthal genome was published. That draft turned scattered fossil DNA into a measuring stick for living humans. But the first measuring stick was rough because ancient DNA is damaged, contaminated, and broken into tiny reeds. That is why the clean room tray matters so much. The evidence is powerful because it is fragile and hard-won. Suddenly, the question was not just, did Neanderthals exist? It was, do any of their letters match ours in a way that points to shared ancestry? And for many people with European or Asian background, the answer came back around 1 to 2%. Wait, that number sounds tiny. So here comes the delayed question we have to carry with us. If the percentage is so small, why did any Neanderthal fragments survive? The answer is not just how much DNA survived, but which genomic neighborhoods kept it and which rejected it. We'll get to that, because first we need to break the biggest myth. Your Neanderthal percentage is not a personality score. It does not tell you that you are stronger, wilder, smarter, colder, or more ancient than someone else. It is an ancestry estimate from genome fragments. Small, measurable, easy to misunderstand. And here's where the story leaves the clean room and moves into the chromosome itself. Picture the DNA you inherited as 2 long decks of cards, one from each parent. Every generation, those decks get shuffled through recombination. So if one of your ancestors inherited a longer Neanderthal block, their children did not receive it as one ancient ribbon forever. Generation after generation, the block gets chopped smaller. That is why your Neanderthal ancestry looks like scattered amber ticks, not a separate Neanderthal chapter stapled into your genome. And this is where the 2% DNA strip becomes tricky. One person may carry one set of fragments, another person carries a different set, a third person carries another. So the archive is not stored in one body, it is spread across a crowd archive. On January 29, 2014, major ancestry mapping studies in Nature and Science helped show this pattern. Across the sampled Europeans and East Asians, one science study found that their different Neanderthal-derived fragments collectively covered about 20% of the Neanderthal genome. Wait, what? That does not mean one person is 20% Neanderthal. It means many people, each carrying small different pieces, preserve a wider scattered record together, and then the measuring stick got sharper. On November 3, 2017, a high-coverage Vindija Cave genome was published. That better Vindija reference helped identify more Neanderthal-derived DNA in present-day humans because cleaner comparison finds smaller surviving fragments. So remember the Vindija bone fragment from the opening. It is not just a fossil on a tray. It is the object that lets the crowd archive become measurable. The answer is small per person and larger across the archive. But a genome map still leaves one huge question hanging in the air. When did this mixing happen? For that, we need the Ronnies and Zlati-Kun ancient genomes and the relatedness patterns they reveal. And this is a different kind of evidence than the Vindija bone fragment. Vindija helps ask, which fragments look Neanderthal? Ronnies and Zlati-Kun help ask, how long ago were those fragments still large enough to date the encounter? A 2024 Nature study, using genomes from Ronnies and Zlati-Kun, estimated that a major shared Neanderthal admixture event occurred about 45 to 49,000 years ago. That gives the 2% DNA strip a proposed date range, not just a percentage. And it pulls the story into a human scene. Modern humans entering Neanderthal territory. Families forming. Children inheriting DNA from both sides. And then roughly 1,500 to 2,000 generations turning those blocks into the broken chromosome bar we saw earlier. One fossil genome made the comparison possible. Recombination shredded ancestry into small blocks. Migration and selection shaped which blocks remained. And now we can answer the delayed question. Some fragments likely stayed because they were neutral enough to pass on. Some specific variants may have affected biological pathways, including immune response, skin biology, metabolism, or gene regulation, though usually in small, variant-specific ways. And some were probably removed because they landed in genomic neighborhoods where they caused problems. That is why Neanderthal DNA is not evenly sprinkled across the genome. It has gaps, clusters, survivors. Back to the screen we opened. A fossil reference compared against living genomes. For years, the simple version was that Neanderthal ancestry mostly belonged to people outside Africa. That is broadly useful, but too simple. A 2020 Cell study argued that some African individuals show stronger apparent Neanderthal ancestry signals than older methods detected, possibly due to back-to-Africa migration and older population structure. So the careful version is better. Non-African ancestry is generally higher, but African genomes are not meaningless blanks in this story. They are part of a messier human network. And this matters because the crowd archive is not just European or Asian people lined up on a chart. It is a moving record of migrations, returns, bottlenecks, and old encounters that fossils only catch in rare flashes. Remember that same Vindija bone fragment? It does not give us a personality test. It gives us a measuring stick. And remember the Ronnies and Zlati-Kun ancient genomes? They help turn the percentage into a dated inheritance event. So how much of you is actually Neanderthal? For many people of European or Asian background, usually about 1 to 2%. But across many living people, the crowd archive preserves a wider patchwork of Neanderthal DNA than any single person carries. That is the trick. Small in you, bigger in us. Back to the Vindija bone fragment on the clean room tray. At the start, it looked like one tiny fossil trying to answer one giant question. Now we can see the loop. The Vindija bone fragment gives the reference. The 2% DNA strip shows the personal inheritance. The Ronnies and Zlati-Kun genomes help give the encounter a time window. And the crowd archive shows why the story is bigger than any one report. The Vindija bone fragment does not show a Neanderthal inside you. It shows how a few ancient fragments became part of modern human variation. The fossil is not a mirror of your personality. It is a ruler for ancestry. This raises a harder question. What other extinct human fragments are still shaping survival in places the fossil record barely reaches? We follow the physical evidence until prehistory becomes a story you can see. Which Neanderthal trade-off would you want decoded next? Immune response, skin biology, or metabolism? See you next time.